Good morning, everyone. Whoa, that was a little loud. I'm Chris Jordan. I'm the city manager. I just wanted to thank all of you for being here today. If you haven't picked up the handouts, please do so. Sign in, do all those things. And so what we have for you today is John Maginot, our city clerk and assistant to the city manager, is going to go through what's involved with being on the commission and the role of the chair and the role of staff, things like that. And then Chris Diaz, our city attorney, who is running a few minutes late, will talk about all the legal issues involved with essentially being a public employee and working with the city on these things. So again, thanks for being here, and I'll turn it over to John.
Great, thanks, Chris. One thing I do want to mention, if you didn't grab the certificate, when we're done, fill this out and leave it so that you get credit for attending, or else you have to watch online and go through it again. We'll go ahead and jump in. Our purpose today is really is as a refresher. Many of you have been serving on commissions for a number of years. Many of you are brand new. And so it's a good opportunity for all of us to be reminded of what our roles are, either as a commissioner or as a staff liaison to a commission. Also understanding the do's and the don'ts. We'll talk a little bit about responsibilities and a little bit about how to better function as commissioners. Our city attorney, when he gets here, will provide an update on any changes in the law. I'll also provide some reminders, things to be aware of. And we'll take a few minutes to answer any questions that you all may have. So, your responsibilities as a commissioner. I think the primary thing to remember is that you represent the city, or in some cases, the cities, the city of Los Altos and town of Los Altos Hills, as a whole. You don't represent an individual or a community group. You don't represent, say, your neighborhood. You represent the entire city. Keep that in mind as you are going about your deliberations, your discussions. Don't push forward and one idea just because that benefits, say, your specific special interest group or your neighborhood. The Commission and Committee Handbook, there are copies here. If you haven't taken a chance to read it, or if you haven't read it for a year or a couple of years, take a minute to do so. It's significantly shorter than it used to be. Hopefully it's easier to read as well. A lot of good information and tips in there. Ahead of your meetings, you'll get your agenda and your agenda packet and any reports and materials. Take a few minutes to read those, be prepared. And then I think the most valuable thing that you can do as a commissioner is to participate in your meetings. We've all been in meetings before where the conversation may be dominated by one or two people. That's not what we want. We want a full body of commissioners deliberating and discussing and sharing ideas and coming up with the best recommendation. If you have questions on any of the materials or any of the items, send those to your staff ahead of time. If they're minor things, they can be answered rather quickly. If they're more in-depth items, that may be something that can be brought up during the meeting so the whole commission can discuss. And then, of course, we need you actually at the meetings because that's where the value is you're attending. The council has set a requirement of at least 75% of your meetings. We know that you are all volunteers. We know that things come up. And so be there for at least 75% of your meetings. Know the schedule and plan your lives accordingly as best you can, of course. And that's really what will benefit the city with your participation. In terms of the staff, now each commission is assigned a staff liaison. Our city manager, Chris, is the one who makes those assignments. Our role as staff is to support you as commissioners and as committee members and help you in your responsibilities as a commission. And we put together the agendas, the reports, and materials. One thing to remember is that the staff does not report to the commission. We all work for Chris. We don't work for the commissions, but we are there to help support you. If there's something that you need in your role as a commissioner, please reach out to your staff liaison, talk with them, see if we can't get the information that you need to make an informed recommendation or decision as a commission. I'm going through this kind of quickly, so if you have questions on anything, raise your hand and let me know. The chair and vice chair of the commission, your role is to manage an effective meeting, to make sure that the discussion is moving along properly, but that everybody is getting a chance to participate. Some things to remember, and I will say at the back of the Commission and Committee Handbook is a cheat sheet for chairs, vice chairs, anybody who may ever have to run a meeting with some of these reminders. Start the meeting on time. Keep it moving along. If the discussion's just kind of going around and around in a circle, maybe bring it back and try to move it forward. As I mentioned, ensure that all the views are heard. If there's one commissioner who's not speaking up, maybe reach out and ask that person, do you have any thoughts, comments, questions? I think this one is really important, is to maintain a decorum, a sense of professionalism during the meetings, while also maintaining respect for the public, for the other commissioners, for staff. On occasion, the commissions will take up what could be a contentious, thank you, a controversial item that may have strong opinions on either side. I think it's important to maintain a level of respect and decorum during the meetings. And then the last is to follow Rosenberg's Rules of Order. Those are, I didn't print them out today, but we have those on our website. Those will really help in terms of how motions are to be formed, what requires a motion, and other procedures for these for commission meetings. One thing that I want to go over briefly was the role of commissions. This comes straight from our commission handbook. You are appointed by the council to advise and make recommendations to the council and staff. Sometimes we have discussions at commission levels where the commission is who may be trying to take an action, which may be appropriate or may not. But primarily you are serving as an advisory role. Trying to think of how most delicately to say this. You're not there to change the policy. You're not there to implement programs and whatnot, but to recommend that the council implement those. As well, I will say Remember that each commission is assigned a specific topic. The Los Altos Municipal Code lays out the powers and duties of each commission. If you haven't had a chance to go and read your commission's powers and duties, I would encourage you to do so. Our municipal code is online. But remember that if you're on the library commission, you're making recommendations about the library and the programs and the services that are there, not talking about, traffic on El Monte Road or whatnot. I mean, that's an extreme example, but remember to stay within the subject matter jurisdiction of your commission. And I think that's what I wanted to cover on that one. And I think, just in time, is our city attorney's update, who just came in.
Apologize for the traffic delay, but yes.
Let me get your...
Where was the traffic heaviest?
The Dumbarton Bridge. I live in Oakland, and then I was coming from Walnut Creek, so yes. Always trying to cross the bridges, and that's the longest delay. So I'm going to stand back here because I kind of like to watch the screen and watch observations from the back of the room, but I'm obviously here to do the commissioner training today. I cover this as kind of a mini ethics overview. I think if you've done AB 1234 training before on ethics, this is going to be a little bit similar to that, but definitely condensed. So I want to talk a little bit today about the Brown Act, obviously, which governs all of your commission meetings, the Public Records Act, which governs any kind of documents or tangible records that we use in our commissioner meetings, as well as at the city, due process and conflicts of interest. This is applicable across the board, I think, for all of you as commissioners, but due process comes into a little more play for planning commissioners, as well as city council, and then talk a little bit about gifts and just the rules that are applicable to you as commissioners. So the Brown Act, obviously we know that governs all of our meetings. It does require that every commission meeting be open and public. That also applies to council meetings. It does mandate that we take public comment on every item on the agenda. For a regular meeting, which is one type of meeting, we actually have to hear public comment on any subject matter jurisdiction that's within your, as a commission, within your body in terms of oversight. There's two types of meetings. We have regular meetings, which is your standard kind of commission meetings, whichever days those happen to lie on. And then there's also special meetings, which usually comes up in the context of city council or planning commission. But special meetings are 24 hours notice. Regular meetings are 72 hours notice. And that is the timeline under the law that we have to get out documentation, as well as let the public know about what's going to be considered. Keep in mind the meeting facility. It does need to be accessible to the public. I've had this come up for some of my clients where they may want to use a facility that is not ADA accessible. And we usually tell them, no, you cannot do that, because we have to make sure that everybody, any member of the public, no matter what their disabilities may be, they need to be able to access that space and be able to participate in that meeting. Teleconferencing is an option. I don't know if we've ever tried it with our commissions, but I know for council, we have used it in the past where someone, essentially a council member, can call in from outside of the jurisdiction, be on the phone and be available to vote and participate. There are very specific requirements that come into play when you teleconference. You do have to post an agenda at the meeting location wherever the council member or commissioner happens to be. So it is a little burdensome, and I usually tell my council members that want to invoke the teleconference provision, just be aware that you need to be accessible somewhere, wherever you are, and you do have to post an agenda at that location and let somebody essentially come and confront you or give public comment if they so desired. So it's a little awkward at times. You don't want to be in a hospital bed where somebody is going to come and give public comment. It's better if you're in what I usually say is if you're on vacation, go to the lobby, sit in the lobby, and just post an agenda behind you, and you can do a conference call that way. We do, under the Brown Act, have a requirement to post an agenda. As I indicated, it's 72 hours for regular meetings and 24 hours for special meetings. So Brown Act, what is permitted and what is not permitted? And this is one of those areas which gets difficult, I think, for newer members of bodies and commissions and how you interact with the law. But keep in mind, individual contacts or conversations between a member and a member of the public is completely fine. You can even talk to one other commissioner that you sit with on the commission. Where it becomes problematic is when you start either in a group setting, get a quorum of that commission together outside of a meeting that's not posted or agendized, or it could become problematic where you're using a staff member to essentially communicate with those other commissioners, or using email. So different mediums can cause Brown Act concerns. I think when in doubt, just what I always tell people is to step out of the process. If you feel like a conversation may be leading you into a Brown Act trap, I would just say, stop the conversation and then check with staff or check with the city attorney's office. So serial meetings are one of the illegal meetings under the Brown Act, and this usually occurs more often than not. I think there's good intent when people are not trying to make this happen, but what it is usually there's a desire to share information, and I usually see this in the context of email. Definitely staff can send a direct email out to the commission to let them know about any kind of information that we obviously want to share with you. If a commissioner was to then hit reply all to that staff email, that's where it starts to become problematic. I will tell you what I do with the city council is I blind carbon copy them on every email that I send them, just to prevent the reply all kind of desire. And it's just an easy way to, I think, keep elected and appointed officials kind of out of trouble. But I will tell you, if you're not BCC'd on an email, just don't hit reply all. If the whole commission's on that email, avoid hitting reply all, because that can create a serial meeting under the Brown Act and create a violation. Also, if let's say staff does one-on-one meetings with each commissioner on a commission, that is completely allowed. Where it becomes problematic is if that staff member, let's say they sit down with Commissioner A, Commissioner B, and Commissioner C, they then share with, let's say they take in information from Commissioner A, they then share with Commissioner B what Commissioner A has said, and vice versa, and that keeps going down the line. If that was to happen, where there's an actual sharing of opinions and essentially how someone may vote on an issue, that's where it becomes problematic. So using an intermediary to essentially facilitate a collective concurrence of the commission outside of a meeting would be a serial meeting in violation of the Brown Act. And then technology, again, email. It could also come up in social media context, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the Brown Act in cyberspace, obviously with the web, with the internet, we are able to share a lot more. And this can create Brown Act issues, and it has in the past for certain elected and appointed officials, at least not at this city, but in other jurisdictions. So we'll talk a little bit about what can occur, I think, in terms of, let's say, a good example is a Facebook post. If one commissioner was to share something on a public Facebook post or share it on let's say the city's Facebook website, which is completely public, if commissioners all started sharing their commentary on a post, you could have potentially what I would consider a violation of the Brown Act. Even though the Facebook post is completely public and open and anybody can access it, the truth is, if there was 3 commissioners essentially sharing information on that post, the public has not been notified of that. They have not had a chance essentially to participate, and so that would be, in my opinion, considered a Brown Act violation. So again, just don't hit reply all. I think when you're looking at emails, even if you're looking at Facebook or let's say it's Nextdoor, if someone is sharing information and they are a commissioner that you sit with or they work for the city in some capacity as a commissioner or appointed, just stay out of the conversation. It's better to just not add to it because when you add to it, then you start creating that collective concurrence. I don't send a message to the entire council. I usually bind carbon copy them. I will tell you as commissioners, do not do the same. I think staff can push out information and that's completely fine, but I think when commissioners start pushing out information as well, the risk is you may want to give your opinion or your comment on what that kind of information you're pushing out is. And when you do that, it starts adding to that, again, collective concurrence of a commission. If they see your opinion, maybe a commissioner that was on the fence may decide to go in that direction. And then from there, you can have one other commissioner kind of hit reply all, and then you have at least 2 of you now sharing opinions with a third that is thinking about the issue, deciding in a certain manner without the public input, which is the critical piece. Don't comment on online posts. Again, I think Nextdoor, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever it happens to be, if you're on a commission and you want to comment on something and you see another commissioner already on there, I would avoid doing that. So the Public Records Act. Before I move on to the Public Records Act, is there any questions about the Brown Act or anything of that sort?
Yeah, sometimes I'm talking for the Historical Commission. You know, we have an event like the Margaret Thompson Essay Contest, and we, all the commissioners, serve ice cream to the children and the parents, and we all come. We don't discuss anything of any, but is that somehow, should we have told everybody we're serving ice cream at the museum?
Thank you for that question. That's actually a really great question. There are numerous exceptions in the Brown Act that can get you out of having to agendize a meeting. A good example of that, if there's a community event sponsored by a group that's outside of the city, let's say it's a nonprofit that's hosting the ice cream event, if they were to do that and invite all the commissioners could attend so long as you don't discuss city business. And then there are also other exceptions for going to conferences. All of that, that would allow us to essentially bypass the Brown Act, only if you meet those narrow exceptions. But in your circumstance, it sounds like we could probably find an exception that would work. Sure.
Janet Harding on the Senior Commission. We sometimes have subcommittee meetings. We never have a quorum, but we have subcommittees of 2 or 3 people, and do work then that we can report to the rest of the commission. Now, I'm assuming that meets everybody's approval.
Also a very good question. I've seen this come up a lot in different contexts, but yes, there are 2 types of subcommittee meetings under the Brown Act. There are ad hoc subcommittee meetings if you have a limited task, and once that task is complete, the subcommittee kind of goes away. That is allowed under the Brown Act so long as you don't have a quorum. For ad hoc subcommittee meetings, you do not have to agendize the meeting. You essentially do not have to comply with the open meeting requirements so long as you don't have a quorum. There's also what's called standing subcommittee meetings, and this is probably more likely in the city council context because they have subcommittees with continuing subject matter jurisdiction. And in those circumstances, you do have to agendize the meeting. You do have to comply with open meeting requirements. But again, so long as you don't have a quorum, it's not a full city council meeting. So yes, in your circumstance, those seem appropriate so long as you don't have a quorum. Sure. Any other questions before we move on? Perfect. Okay, so Public Records Act, obviously anything that we produce here at the city that is tangible, that is paper, that's email, that's text, that's drawings, that's CDs, whatever it happens to be, if it's a tangible record of some sort, it is subject to the California Public Records Act, which more likely than not means that if somebody requested that information, we may have to provide it over to that requester unless we can meet one of the exemptions under the law. So this was a big case that came down last year. It's the City of San Jose versus Superior Court. This is a case where, I'm trying to remember the facts, but if I recall correctly, public officials in San Jose were essentially using both city email, but then they were also using private email accounts, so Gmail, AOL, whatever it happens to be. They may have also been using their private text or cell phone devices to text message each other. In that instance, we had a request come in San Jose, essentially asking for those records, so those private emails, those private text. In that case, San Jose responded and basically said, we don't have control over that information. We can't produce it to you. The case worked its way up, all the way up to the California Supreme Court. And the California Supreme Court last year basically decided the issue and said, regardless of where you're doing city business, if it's city business, it is subject to the Public Records Act. So if you are using, and I know a lot of commissioners here do have private email accounts that we use for city business, just keep in mind if we ever got a Public Records Act request, we would just ask you to check your email account to let us know what you have in terms of city records and provide those over to the city. We would not actually go into your account of any sort, but that is the case, and that is essentially what it held. I do see a question.
As far as all commissioners use private email accounts. The city doesn't provide email accounts for commissioners. Do you think it's a good idea for them to do that?
I'll look over to our staff. I don't know if we have the capacity. Yeah, no, I'm thinking more of the cost in terms of providing city accounts. That's my concern, and that's why I look to staff. But it's not a problem so long as you are aware that any city email in your private account could be subject to disclosure. And so this is a new law that I think is not pending, but I believe kicked in January 1st, or it could be pending, and I'll confirm that and I can let the commission know through our city clerk. But this is a bill that would essentially expand that case that we just covered, the San Jose case, and essentially indicate that any personal email address, if there's stuff in there about city business, it is subject to disclosure. So just a good reminder that I think, if you want to set up, if you want to use your own private email account, or if you want to set up a separate private email account just for city business, that may be one way to just keep, your emails essentially from being commingled in one account. But again, it's us asking you, if we ever got a request, do you have city emails in your private account? Can you please provide us copies of those? And that's how we would go about dealing with the Public Records Act request. So best practices is, yes, we do advocate for agency-specific email accounts. If a city cannot do that because if it's a cost issue or whatever it happens to be, just be aware that, again, those emails that are city-specific, we will ask you for copies of those if we ever got a request. And one way you could deal with this is, again, creating a separate private email account that's solely for city business. So wanted to cover one hypo, and there's actually a couple, I think, within the slides. But the first one is all 5 members of a city commission are attending a conference. And I may have given this one away by giving some discussion earlier, but 3 of the members go out to dinner. So again, you have 5 members of a commission, 3 of them go out to dinner at a conference. Is this a Brown Act violation? I think in this instance it's 5. So 3 would be a quorum. So you have 3, a quorum out at dinner. Correct. That's actually a good answer. So yes, is there a Brown Act violation? It depends. If they discuss city business at this dinner, then yes, there could be a Brown Act issue. If it's purely a social, just out to dinner, having a good time, talking about the conference, that would not be a problem. But if you're going to sit at a dinner at a conference and talk about, a future agenda item that's coming up before you, then that would be problematic. So second hypo, during a commission meeting, 3 of 5 members, again, you have a 5-member commission, you have 3 looking down into their laps. A local blogger, or let's say it's a reporter in this case, is sitting at the meeting, and they later ask if the Brown Act was violated by sending text or emails to each other about agency business. So was the Brown Act violated? And I apologize to you, the answers were supposed to come up after the fact, but apparently they're coming up in advance, so you're being given the answers. But yes, in this instance, so this is a good rule to keep in mind, and I advocate for all of my councils, and then I would say every commission that's here at the city. You do not want to be on the dais texting or sending emails to your fellow commissioners. And the reason for that is because the public is then being deprived of that vital information, and they are being excluded from that private communication. If you're sitting in a public open meeting, the logic is you're supposed to be having those open discussions in front of the public so that they can then hear that discussion, be a part of that discussion, be able to comment on that discussion. And if you're doing that through an email account or through text messaging, you're depriving the public of that right, and that would be a violation of the Brown Act. Is that text or email, if they are emailing or texting each other, is that a public record? And the short answer is yes. If they're communicating about anything city-related, no matter where that account happens to be, if it's your private cell phone device, it's a private email account, that would be a public record. And in my opinion, there would probably be no exemptions that would apply to that. So the way this usually works, and I've seen in other circumstances, if somebody wanted to challenge the decision that you were considering as a commission, and they saw you looking into your phones and texting or emailing, somebody that wanted to challenge that decision could essentially say, number 1, the commission's violated the Brown Act, and 2, as proof, we're going to request those records to basically show the public that they did violate the law. So always be careful, I think, when you're sitting on the dais. Make sure that communication, that discussions, it's happening out in the open forum. It's allowing the public to be able to hear that and to comment. So another hypo, and the answers are given away again, so apologies about that. During a commission meeting, a local resident texts 3 of the 5 members of the commission asking them to vote a certain way. Has the Brown Act been violated? And I'm sure you all know that the answer would be no. In that instance, if a member of the public is pushing out information one way to a quorum of the commission, it is not a Brown Act violation. It's similar to staff pushing out information one way. Now, it becomes tricky because if one of those commission members replies to that email or to that text, then at that point you have potential collective concurrence forming. If a second member was to hit reply all, and let's say they were all sharing opinions, yes, I'm going to vote in agreement with you, I'm in agreement with the resident, and then somebody else responds, either I'm in disagreement or I am in agreement, you have that risk of a Brown Act issue occurring. And I would say when the first person responds, the first commissioner, they've started the risk. When the second person responds, I would say you have an affirmative Brown Act violation at that point. And then again, is it a public record? Yes. So quickly, we'll cover conflicts of interest. The first area of the law we'll cover is Political Reform Act, and as you know, the Political Reform Act is what mandates that all of us file Form 700s, that we think about our personal economic interest in every decision that we make for the city. A short way I like to think about this is I've often used a decision-making lens in my other jurisdictions, and what I tell my clients there is, think about what is in the best interest of the city. It's not always about what's in our best personal interest. It's more so what is the greater good. And at least with the Political Reform Act, you always want to think about how does this affect the greater good. Do not focus, obviously, on your own economic interests, because that's where the law would essentially impede you and stop you from doing so. So the different types of economic interest, we have business investments, sources of income, any kind of business position or employment that you hold, any kind of real property. It could be both purchased as well as leased, if the lease is essentially more than a month-to-month term. Gifts, and so if you were to receive a gift from somebody in certain circumstances, that could cause a conflict of interest. Also, your personal finances, if they are impacted positively or negatively by a decision, that could pose a conflict of interest for you. So if you did have what I tell my commissioners, I think if you ever are sitting, reading your agenda in anticipation of a commission meeting, and you do feel that your personal economic interests are somehow implicated by that decision, that should be a red flag for you to get staff involved, work with your staff liaison, ask them to contact the city attorney's office. We're happy to look into conflict issues as they pop up for you. But it really would have to be an economic interest if somehow your employer, the decision concerns is within 500 feet of your property. If there's other types of economic interest at play, red flags should be going off in your head. Contact staff, contact the city attorney's office, and we're happy to look into the issue for you. But if you did have a conflict, there is a recusal process. And so usually you do have to either identify that somewhere on the record. So what I've usually seen council members do, or commission members, is you announce the conflict, you indicate what the financial interest is at play, you leave the room, and you essentially get up out of your seat and step out of the process to essentially avoid influencing the process. For councils that have consent agendas, there is one exception. So if a council member did have a conflict on an item that was on consent, they do not have to actually get up out of their seat. They can remain seated and go ahead and vote on the item, obviously with their recusal from the one item on consent that they have a conflict on, but they can remain seated. And this is a narrow exception, but it's designed to allow someone to remain seated where there's going to be no discussion on something that they have a conflict on. Sure.
If you're recusing yourself because you live in the neighborhood near the matter being discussed, but you actually have to leave the room. You can't sit in and you're getting there? I'm sorry.
That's a perfect question, perfect timing. That very last bullet point there, I think, addresses your question. And the question was, if you do have some sort of financial interest in a decision, are you always required to leave the room? Is there any exception to remain in the room and give your public comment as essentially any other member of the public would? And there is one exception where you do have an interest that would implicate your property interest and other types of interest. Yes, you can essentially recuse yourself from your commission seat, but then take a seat in the audience and potentially give public comment if so desired on the agenda topic itself, just as a member of the public. So if you have if you have a conflict of interest on an agenda item and you have an economic interest somehow that's implicated. A good example would be, let's say you have a trash contract coming up, a franchise agreement, that everybody in the city is going to be subject to paying those franchise fees and those solid waste fees as part of their service. So in that instance, if you somehow had a financial interest in that agreement, I will tell you another city of mine, a council member, her husband was a landscaper that worked as a subconsultant for a subsidiary of a trash contractor. And so we had the trash contract on our agenda. Very elongated process to get down to her financial interest, but her husband was in litigation with one of the subs that was involved with that franchisee. So we did tell her to step out of that process. We were concerned that she did have a financial interest. But at the same time, she was also going to be a property owner in the city that is going to be subject to those franchise and solid waste fees. And so she wanted to hear the outcome of the ultimate decision, who was going to be selected for the trash contract. She was able to, in that instance, essentially recuse herself from the council seat, but sit in the audience. And if she wanted to comment on the trash contract or what she thought was best for the city, she could do so. She opted not to comment in that instance, but she did sit in the audience and essentially listen to the process instead of step out of the room. So it's a very narrow exception. If you're ever thinking about invoking it, check with staff, check with my office, and we can definitely help guide in that process. Okay, so due process. This is one of the areas of the law that I actually find to be the most important. It does not apply to, I would say, all of you, but it will definitely apply to City Council, to Planning Commission, those of you who deal with any kind of land use decisions. This is an area of the law that is important, that a lot of people do not think about, but I will tell you that developers are always thinking about when they want to challenge a process. So what is due process? It's memorialized in the U.S. Constitution. It basically indicates that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So due process of the law is obviously providing notice, not only to, let's say, the individual that life, liberty, or property interest would be implicated, but also those around that person so that they have a hand in the process as well. In the land use context, notice comes in the form of, I know we do send out distancing noticing requirements for land use decisions. So not only the property that's being the subject of the decision, but obviously notice to the neighboring property owners. And then also our agendas do provide notice as well. We also need to provide an opportunity to be heard. That means obviously have a meeting, have an allowance for public comment. If the individual at stake has a property interest and they're asking the city for some sort of land use decision, we'd want to make sure that person has an opportunity to be heard by the decision makers. And then finally, a fair and impartial decision maker. You see that image of someone sleeping there. That is what not to do. When you have a land use decision before you as a planning commission, as a city council, or even some of you as just informational for your commission, you want to stay alert, you want to stay awake, you want to make sure that everybody involved in the process knows that you're being fair, you're being impartial, you're actually listening to the process, and you're giving that person, whoever's being heard, the opportunity to speak their mind, and you're paying attention to that process as well. And then due process would also require that you disclose any ex parte contacts. So if you are, let's say for Planning Commission, if a developer wants to meet with you in some capacity, or you go out to visit the site of a potential land use decision, you do want to disclose that on the record. So before the decision's actually made, before you give an opinion, you're going to want to indicate to the public, as well as, let's say, a developer in this context, that you visited the site, that you've looked at the surroundings, that you, whatever it happens to be, if you've had other communications that you think that they should be aware of, you want to disclose those on the record so that it allows the other side to essentially respond to what they're hearing from you in terms of what you saw. So best practices for due process, and I will tell you, due process obviously lays out a procedural step that we need to comply with, which is notice, a fair and impartial decision maker, an opportunity to be heard. But there's also bias in decisions that can occur. I will tell you that if you ever feel that as a commissioner that you cannot make a decision based on just the facts before you, let's say there's someone before you as a commissioner that maybe you just don't like, or maybe you really like the person, and you like them so much you want to say yes to the decision just because it's the person at issue versus the actual facts. If you ever feel that you can't make a fair decision and you are basing your decision on something other than the facts that are before you, that means you can't be fair. That means there's a risk of bias. And so in those circumstances, I would try to step out of the process if you can. If you feel that you can be fair, then work with my office and we can work with you to essentially make a statement on the record indicating to everybody why you can be fair. This often comes up in the context of land use decisions. Again, if a developer doesn't like things they've heard from a commissioner, they may raise this issue, and it's something that we do have to address at the city level because it creates risk for the agency. But best practices, if you can't be fair, don't participate, step out. Avoid statements before the close of the hearing, and in this instance, so land use decisions, what I say to council members, to planning commissioners, you want to hear from everybody. You want to hear from the developer, you want to hear from the public, you want to take in all of that public comment, and you also want to hear from staff. Before you state any opinions out there in the world, you want to hear all of that information, and that usually occurs at a actual land use decision hearing. So you'll have staff present, you'll hear from the developer, you'll hear from the public, and then at that point, once that public hearing is closed, you can state any opinion you want. But I always tell people, listen to the whole process before you get to the point of having an opinion, and that is part of due process as well, just complying with taking in all the information before stating an objective opinion. Make decisions based on the administrative record. Again, that's what staff is presenting to you. That's what's being presented in the commission hearing. You don't want to go beyond that. Again, avoid the appearance of bias. If you feel like you can't make a decision just based on the facts, step out. Again, you want to pay attention. So you don't want to fall asleep in a commission meeting because that would allude to the fact that I think you do not have a fair decision maker. And then above all, you're going to be judged by your fairness and integrity. I think we're all here because we want to see the city do well, and we want to see the city be successful. And one of the ways that we do that is by being interested commissioners. All right, one more hypo. Planning Commissioner Smith rents an apartment month to month, next to a property whose owner is seeking a variance to build a home that will interfere with his ocean views. So again, you have a planning commissioner rents an apartment next to a property that's going to come into a planning commission hearing for a potential variance approval because this neighboring property owner wants to build a home that it looks like it's going to interfere with the commissioner's views. Smith is opposed to the variance application before the zoning administrator, so in this case it might be our planning director. So planning director approves it, and we have the commissioner opposed, and now the commissioner is appealing it up to the planning commission, so he's going to be seated in that meeting. Can the commissioner participate in the decision by the planning commission? I hear some no's. That's a good point. Very, very good point. So I heard some no's. I heard the focus on the month-to-month tenancy. Let's see. So in this instance, he would not have a Political Reform Act conflict of interest because you are correct. He has a month-to-month tenancy, which under the law is not an actual real property ownership interest. If he was to own the apartment or had a lease that was at least a year, then that would be an economic interest subject to the Political Reform Act. But the reason the answer is no, even though he doesn't have a true conflict of interest, is it's clear from the facts that he's worried about his ocean view. To me, at that point, you are unable to make a fair and impartial decision because you are inherently interested in the outcome of the decision. And so in this case, the member would not be neutral, would not be fair, and we would recommend essentially stepping out of the process. Now, I've had situations where a commissioner may have said to themselves, no, if the view gets blocked, I can still make a fair decision. I want to make a statement on the record. There's usually a bit of tug and war in that instance because my position as city attorney is the risk is too great, and then the commissioner's opinion may be that there's a way that they could essentially be fair in the process. But it truly is, it's something that, in my opinion, it creates too much risk, and I would advise that commissioner to step out.
You're not an attorney to the commissioner, so why would one take advice from an attorney who's not your attorney?
I'm an attorney for the city, but yeah, so my goal is to keep the city safe, and that's where my position and my advice comes from every step of the way, to keep this city safe, to keep all of the taxpayer funding safe, to keep all of the risk at bay. That is my job. So So again, Planning Commissioner Jones wrote a blog post stating that a controversial development proposal would impact critical wildlife habitat and important views in the community. Can Commissioner Jones participate in the decision by the Planning Commission? So again, this one's giving you the answer. Sorry about that. So in this instance, we do have there is a landmark case that's out there for planning commissions. It's called NASHA, and what that case essentially held is, in that instance, a planning commissioner wrote an editorial before they got on the planning commission. It was a big project in that community, and the planning commissioner, at the time that they were just a regular resident, wrote an editorial essentially opposing the project. They were then appointed to the planning commission, and the question came up, could they sit there as a planning commissioner and make a fair and impartial decision when they've already written an editorial out there that's in the public domain, essentially opposed to the project? And in that case, the court said no, that commissioner cannot be fair and impartial. They've already weighed in on the decision, even before hearing all of the facts. They've already essentially authored an editorial piece out there opposed to the project. It would be essentially almost impossible, the court concluded, for that person to be impartial. And so this is a very similar circumstance based on that case. When you have somebody writing any kind of opinion piece out there, either as a resident or a commissioner, and that decision then comes before you, it's implied that you cannot be impartial at that point. I see a hand go up. Let me walk over there.
Thanks. So if there's an issue, say, before the city council, and a commissioner speaks as a private citizen, right, and they voice an opinion that might come before the commission, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that circumstance, usually things go to city council last. I think if there is something that comes before you as a commission where you do have an opinion, and then it does elevate itself up to council where you still have that opinion, maybe that's an individual opinion. In that instance, because it's outside of it's no longer going to go back to your commission, I would hope, I would say you can essentially make public comment at city council level at that point. I think it would become more problematic if council was going to direct that decision to go back to the commission for some sort of input, and you're essentially stating positions as a member of the public. You may want to hold off on that until it works its way back. This way you can participate at least at the commission level in that decision. The risk is if you do state some opinions outside of the domain of the commission, you may have to step out of that actual decision when it comes back to you. So that would be the risk. Okay, we'll quickly cover gifts, and this is probably more applicable to those at the council level, the staff level. It seems unlikely that commissioners would receive gifts by members of the public, but I just want to make sure that we're fully aware of what those laws are. Obviously, gift laws apply to anything that someone offers you solely because of your position as a commissioner. That would include meals, entertainment, travel. Anything that's a personal benefit to you would be considered a gift. Under the Political Reform Act, we do have to disclose any gifts of $50 or more. So if somebody buys you a coffee, it would not be something subject to disclosure. You could essentially accept the cup of coffee and not worry about having to report that on your Form 700. If you do receive gifts from any one entity that exceeds $470, which, in my opinion, that's a good amount, you would essentially have to refuse those gifts. So anything in excess of $470. And then keep in mind that if you do accept gifts that are at the 470 level, it could subject you to disqualification if that person that's given you the gift or the entity that's provided the gift appears before the commission at any point. Yes, so if you do have to, and I don't know if all of you have to report Form 700s pursuant to our local conflict of interest code, but if you do, this is where these requirements would kick in. Thank you. But these are all the exceptions. So even though you may take a gift, there are numerous exceptions in the law, and they are exhaustive. So if there's ever questions about what gifts apply, what gifts don't, please check with staff. They can check with the city attorney's office, and we can weigh in. But the common exceptions are essentially gifts to the public agency. So if there's a gift given to the city itself and the city decides how it's essentially delegated out to staff, that's not a gift to you personally. It's a gift to the city, and there's a separate form that we would use for that. Gifts that are returned unused or donated within 30 days. If you were to return the gift or donate it to a nonprofit within 30 days, it would not be personal to you and therefore not subject to reporting. If you get a gift from your family member, spouse, whatever it happens to be, that's not reportable. Obviously, we're only concerned about potential bribery and stuff of that nature where you have outside entities giving you gifts. Gifts of hospitality, if somebody invites you down to Southern California for the weekend to spend the weekend at their home, that's not a gift that you'd have to report. Reciprocal exchanges, so if I let's say routinely take the city manager out to lunch when I'm at City Hall, and if he does the same for me on occasion, it should even out, and so that would not be a gift subject to reporting. Tickets and passes to certain fundraisers. These sometimes can be gifts, but if they are to the agency itself and the agency is determining how those tickets are then used by staff, they would not be subject to the gift reporting by an individual. And then new personal gifts. This is a new area of the law that talks about just gifts that are personal to you. There's nuances to this, so I think if there's ever questions, we're happy to weigh in. So, rules of the road and taking gifts from transportation companies. This is an area of the law that I think has been a holdover from the days of the railroad. And what would happen in the past is I think the railroad entities would essentially provide free accommodations for the legislature traveling up to Sacramento. In those instances, it became where I think the railroad had a very strong hold on the state legislature because they were getting all of these free trips. At some point, the law kicked in finally to catch up, and it basically said that can't be happening anymore. If you're a public official, you cannot accept passes or discounts from large transportation companies. A clear exception for this is obviously if you have frequent flyer miles or something of that sort, that is okay. That is not a problem. But again, this is a holdover from the days of the railroad and how much leverage and power they did have over Sacramento. So if we were to give you, let's say, as part of a conference packet, a large, let's say, binder with just information, whether it be agendas for the meeting, whether it be white papers, if we give all of that to you, and obviously it does have some value, it would not be considered a gift because it's informational. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we did take some along the way. If there's any questions that I can answer, though, that are burning, I'm happy to do so.
Are we actually supposed to call you if we have an issue? Because we're then subjecting the city to your bill and running up legal fees. And I've been instructed I should have talked to you on occasion. Instead, I talked to the state of California, but that was free. I don't know, but so what's the advice here? What's city policy on commissioners engaging with you?
It's a great question, too. Obviously, we want to be mindful of cost. I'm an outside attorney, so we do bill by the hour. What I'd recommend is starting with the staff liaison. So if there is a liaison to your commission, starting with them, asking them the question, then they can decide if they think it's important enough to get my office involved. Obviously, they'll check with the city manager as well, but that'll be the trigger to kind of figure out where do we need to go with the issue.
I guess I'm asking because the response I got was, why didn't you just call the attorney?
And you could probably do that too. My information is there. I think what I will do is, I think if any of you ever reach out to me, I will check in with the staff liaison, obviously, to see what the issue is and see if this is something city wants me to look into. But yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. It doesn't mean I'm automatically doing work. I'll check with staff first and then get input from them to see if it's something they'd like us to look into. Well, thank you all. I appreciate it.
Well, are there any other questions? There was one slide left on the other presentation that I'll go over very quickly. You remember I had reached out and said, well, are there any questions that you may have? One that did come up was regarding the role of council liaisons. This is a fairly new thing, as you've noticed. The council has assigned a council member to each commission. The guidance that I have comes again from the commission handbook. It's really to facilitate the flow of communication between the council and the commissions. But the question has come up, well, what exactly does that mean? What is the role of a council liaison at a commission meeting? And I would say that is between you and the council, particularly your liaison. If you as a commission feel you want more input, you can ask the council member. They would be speaking solely for themselves, of course, unless it's something that the council has weighed in on or has decided. If you feel that a council member is, let's say, too involved, or is taking over a conversation too much, talk with that person. You as commissioners report to the council, and so the purpose again is to have the dialogue between the council and the commission. So if something is not working, or if you feel you need more, talk with the council member. Discuss, well, what exactly is it that you need from your liaison. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Hi, I get this. I understand this. There is a little nuance when we ask our liaison, well, have you experienced something like this at the council level? Or, is that all right?
Sure. No, I think that's totally fine. Again, it's what you as a commission and you as your liaison feel is most appropriate. Asking, well, how do you think the council might respond to this? Fine. Remember, though, that the council member can only speak for themselves unless that is a topic that the council has discussed previously. Okay. We've put you through a lot. Are there any final questions before we let you go? Yes, so the certificates, just leave them up here, and then you'll get credit for participating. So thank you all for coming.